Thank you, Brian, for those kind words, and thank you, Colby and Jacob and Loyola for inviting me to give this talk and be part of this conference. What I'm going to say this afternoon is very much a part of this conversation with Jack Caputo and Marion and David Tracy, which has been going on for some time. So I hope to maybe continue it with some of you here today. And it'll be in two parts. Firstly, sort of outlining what I mean by anatheism, and secondly, moving on to a theopoetics of application, looking at some works of literature and some paintings. So, to begin with the definition and description of anatheism, beginning with the term ana. So ana, in the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, is defined as up in space or time, back again anew. So understood, the term supports the deeper and broader sense of after contained in the expression God after God. The poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Jesuit and a priest, describes the moment of imaginative creation as aftering, seconding, over and overing. He speaks of poetic epiphany, accordingly, as a retrieval of past experience that moves forward, proffering new life to memory, giving a future to the past. What Hopkins means by this, I think, is that certain deep experiences can be followed by moments of disenchantment, after which we may return again to the primal experience in a new light, over and over. Ana. As a religious poet, Hopkins is speaking of a specifically sacred reimagining. In his own case, he expressed this in a series of dark sonnets followed by sacred sonnets. The dark sonnets begin with such lines as, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day, or the mind has mountains, sheer, frightful, no man fathomed, hold them cheap may those who ne'er hung there. And then these sonnets are followed by what he calls the sacramental sonnets of celebration of pied beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, everything that is spare, strange, contrary, precious, rare. Though himself a Catholic, this notion of sacramental epiphany and repetition, overing and aftering, is not confined to any one particular religion. It refers to any poetic movement of returning to God after God, which, of course, for Hopkins was lived in a deeply and profoundly Christian and mystical way. God after the loss of God, as in child's play, gone, back again, fort da. We learn young that what disappears as literal comes back again as figural, that is, as sign and symbol, as a second presence in and through absence. And symbol here does not mean untrue or unreal. The return of the lost one, in the case of religion, the lost God, may well be one of more real presence. It may, in fact, be much more powerful and moving a presence precisely because of its return in and through and after abstention. Anatheism, then, is not the end of religion, but the end of religion. Or as Jean-Luc Marion put it in our conversation, la sortie de la religion. Thus, in the prefix ana, we find the idea of retrieving, revisiting, reiterating, repeating, but repeating forwards, not backwards. It's not about regressing nostalgically to some prelapsarian past or golden age. It's a question, rather, of coming back afterwards in order to move forward again. Reculer pour mieux sauter. So it's in this sense that we use the term anatheism as a returning to God after God. A critical hermeneutic retrieval of sacred things that have passed, but still bear a radical remainder, an unrealized potentiality or promise to be more fully realized in the future. In this way, anatheism may be understood as after faith, which is much more than a simple afterthought or after effect. After faith is eschatological, something ultimate in the end that was in fact already there before the beginning. And that's why the after of ana is also a before that has been transposed, so to speak, into a second after, as in, for example, before Abraham was, I am. Anatheism, then, is not simply a dialectical third term which supersedes theism and atheism. And this clarification, I must say, is due in large part to some clarificatory exchanges I've had with Jack Caputo on this subject over the years. It is not some Hegelian synthesis of final resolution. It's eschatology, not teleology. I would even say that anatheism precedes and exceeds the binary opposition between theism and atheism. It contains a moment of atheism within itself, as it does a moment of theism. Or should I say, anatheism pre-contains both, for it operates from a space and time before the dichotomy of theism and atheism, as well as after it. The double A of anatheism, ana, holds out the promise, but not the necessity, of a second reaffirmation once the death of God has done its work, the death of a certain kind of God, of course. But it differs radically from Hegel's negation of the negation, which sees the return as a totalizing sublation, Aufhebung. By contrast, the term of ana signals a risk and a wager, a dangerous drama that can go either way and can also go wrong. It's up to us mortals, creatures, in the end. It's a matter of discernment and decision and faith on our part. The event does not take place behind our backs, irrespective of our agency, like theodicy or a dialectic of absolute spirit. There is no ruse of reason. Anatheism is not some electable dialectic leading to a final totality. It's not about uppercase divinity at all, alpha or omega gods. Au contraire, anatheism is about re-imaging and reliving the sacred in the least of these, elakistos. It is lowercase from beginning to end. And that's why we chose this image, which you see there, Pneuma Hostis by Seelig Chair, for the volume of conversations, because it actually, it's made from cigarette butts, which are painted in gold leaf, the most discarded of and toxic of remainders, and placed into the frames, the blades of a Lasco fan, which is for extracting and purging toxic fumes. So in the words of the artist herself, Pneuma Hostis, she says, is a flaming halo created out of gold-leafed cigarette butts, a maze mandala in the form of a commercial Lasco fan. The butts and the fan blades come together in the shape of a gold host, where inhalation and exhalation, life and death, health and illness, the addict and the saint share the same space. The idea of returning to God after God, ana, of rediscovering the holy in happenstance, the iconic and the ordinary, the highest and the lowest. Here the sacramental mingles with the banal, and transcendence can be found in the most base or everyday things. In short, to cite scripture, anatheism is a way of retrieving the sacred in the least of these, even in discarded, smoked out butts. So to return to the discussion of anatheism and atheism, theism, we can say that anatheism concentrates on unrealized possibilities which are more powerfully reanimated if one also experiences a moment of atheism. The A here being a gesture of abstention, privation, withdrawal. The atheist moment here is less a matter of epistemological theory than a pre-reflective lived experience of ordinary lostness and solitude, a mood of angst or abandon, an existential dark night of the soul. And who has not tasted such moments? Even Mother Teresa, we're told in her diaries, confessed to such moments. And Christ himself on the cross experienced such an atheist moment in, my God, why have you forsaken me? The moment of radical abandon, followed by an anatheist return unto thee I commend my spirit. Myself and Jack were part of a seminar recently, the God Seminar in Santa Rosa, where I was taken to task for putting those two together. I was reminded that in the texts, these are two very different texts, Luke and Matthew. So I pointed out, well, you know, I'm Catholic, so I don't know scripture, number one. And two, even if I did, That's why we have 2 Gospels and not 1, and 3 rather than 2, and 4 rather than 3, because people leave things out, so you need another one to supplement it. In any case, that's a theopoetic reconstruction, if you like, of the 2 final cries of Jesus. But the atheist moment of abandonment, mutual abandonment, in fact, of Father and Son, is, in its very kenosis, is, second kenosis, is, it seems to me, indispensable to the moment, the attendant moment of unto thee I commend my spirit. This privative moment, the first A, is indispensable to Anatheism. But in Ana we have 2 A's, and if the first A is the A of atheism, the second A is the not of the not, the double AA of Anatheism, a reopening to something new. Unto thee I commend my spirit. Or to cite Levinas's beautiful reflection on adieu, you have in that phrase the double sense of welcoming, adieu, but also goodbye. There's the abdeo of adieu, the A as an ab, leaving, abstention, and the A as ad deum, moving towards God. And Levinas captures this also as adieu is contre Dieu. And he cites the example of Jacob wrestling with the angel, the dark man, Ish, in order to retrieve the name of Israel. You've got to be contre Dieu. You've got to struggle with God, wrestle with God in this double A sense. But I'd like to return to this double A of adieu as abstention and as advent, as moving away from and moving towards, when we come to the image later of Andrei Rubliev's perichoresis. So I repeat, the ana is not a guarantee of ineluctable progress or naive optimism. It's not just something that arises in the wake of religious collapse, but also something that brings us back to the beginning, to a foretime, a sacred foreplay, as it were, before the division between theism and atheism. And in this respect, I think of Kierkegaard's affirmative reading of repetition as a reliving of the past forward. This repetition of former as latter, of the earlier as later, meant for Kierkegaard retrieving the event of faith not as a regression to some original position, but as an originary disposition of openness towards the radical other, what he calls a leap of faith in fear and trembling. Abraham had to lose his son as a given in order to receive him back as a gift. He had to abandon Isaac as possession in order to welcome back as promise. Isaac was not Abraham's, either as extension, acquisition, projection, but another's, another, an other, a return gift of what Kierkegaard calls the absolute. In short, it is a matter, again, of repeating forwards rather than backwards, a second retrieval of something after you've lost it. And this goes clearly beyond chronological time, the notion of different moments succeeding each other in a linear succession, in favor of chirological time, a time out of time focusing on epiphanic moments of grace, where eternity crosses the instant. The ana here is a prefix that seeks to capture this enigma of past as future, before as after. Before Abraham was, I am. We do this in memory of Christ until he comes. You fail logic for that way of thinking about time. To say all this is not, however, to deny that ana involves historical time. Infinite time is in the finite. It traverses finite temporality and cannot exist without it. As I understand it, anatheism, in its current manifestation, does indeed coincide with a concrete historical situation that comes after the death of God, culturally, socially, and intellectually. It responds, for example, to the critical announcement of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, the famous hermeneutics of suspicion, to the atheist exposés of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, to the modern critique of religion as ideology and false consciousness, etc. Anatheism expresses a typical modern anxiety in the face of what Max Weber calls the disenchantment, Entzauberung of the world, the desacralizing of society, the general malaise of the abandonment of God. In this sense, anatheism is indeed an historical cultural phenomenon which engages with our contemporary secular humanist culture, but not in any supersessionist manner, namely the patronizing idea that we were ignorant and have now seen the light. All faith was, sort of infantile delusion, but we have finally reached the end of religion and are free at last. In sum, it's not complicit with the faddish anti-God squad of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, or indeed Fukuyama's neoliberal hubris. Anatheistically considered, to lose the illusion of God as sovereign superintendent of the universe is rather to enjoy the possibility of opening oneself again to the primal promise of a sacred stranger, the absolute other who comes as gift, call, summons, as invitation to hospitality and to justice, who appear to Abraham and Sarah, as we will be seeing, to Mary of Nazareth, and to countless human creatures since, and indeed probably every instance of every day. In short, anatheism is a radical opening to someone or something that was lost by Western metaphysics and Christendom and needs to be recalled. That is simply to put it in a Christian context. Of course, one could say the same thing in a Jewish or an Islamic or a Buddhist or a Hindu context. But I'm confining myself here, since we're talking about the Catholic tradition, largely to the Christian narrative, which happens to be my own. And here I think we can translate from the historical formulation of the anatheist question, what comes after the disappearance of God now in the 20th, 21st century, to the more existential one. How might any human person experience this in his or her concrete lived experience at any point in time? This is why I constantly try to come back to examples and testimonies of the anatheist moment, to actual descriptions, scriptural, literal, testimonial, of lived abandonment, disillusionment, disorientation, followed by moments of turning around again, what Socrates called periagoge, what Augustine called conversio. The negative moment of letting go is indispensable. It's a key to the proper appreciation of anatheism, without which we have cheap grace, God as comforting illusion, quick fix, opium of the people. We might think here again, since we're talking existentially now, not historically, not metaphysically, but existentially, of the mystic's dark night of the soul, mentioned earlier in the case of Hopkins, or St. John of the Cross, as mentioned by Professor Pepperzak this morning. Or we might think of Dostoevsky's sense of radical alienation, followed by faith, when he says faith comes forth. Genuine faith comes forth from the crucible of doubt. Or of Christ's own abandonment, sense of abandonment by the Father on the cross. These are all concrete moments of radical emptying which signal a return to the inaugural moment of anatheism, the wager of yes or no to the stranger. This primal wager is first and foremost an existential wager, not a purely logical one a la Pascal, which is more a wager of knowledge than being. It's more epistemological than ontological. I believe that the anatheist wager to turn hostility into hospitality is the inaugural moment of all great wisdom traditions. Though admittedly, in this conversation and most of the conversation around anatheism, it has been largely connected to the Abrahamic discussion, the Abrahamic tradition. So, let me now, in the second part of this paper, look at some of these examples of anatheism in theopoetics, drawing from some examples in literature and some examples in paintings, particularly paintings which refer back to what I call these inaugural anatheist moments, the three strangers appearing to Abraham and Sarah, and the angel Gabriel appearing to the Nazarena, Mary of Nazareth. Anna is not just a question of returning in time, but also in space. It involves a topos as well as a kairos. It needs, I am suggesting, images. It's not just a question of rethinking God after God, but reimagining God after God. Why is that so important? Why does theopoetics matter? Reimagining the sacred means opening a space of negative capability. I take the term from the poet John Keats, who defined negative capability as, I quote, the ability to be in mystery, uncertainty, and doubt without the irritable reaching after fact and reason. I see the poetic refiguring of the sacred as a form of Anatheist disposition. And this is not something confined to Keats and Romanticism. It's something that goes right back to the beginning of Western culture, Greek culture, as Aristotle acknowledged in the Poetics, when he defines drama as a cathartic movement back and forth between pity and fear. And when Aristotle talks of fear, phobos, he does not mean what we mean today by phobias. He means a taking of a distance, which theatre provides, theatre as providing a spectacle, a vision, theatros. And this was important for Aristotle because it meant that one no longer had to literally sacrifice the pharmakoi, the godmen, Dionysus and so on, nor indeed the animal vicarious substitutes, the lamb or the goat. In fact, tragedy means goat's head. Because now we have moved into the realm of mimesis mythos, that is to say, of poetics. And in that move, the men, the sacrificial victims, replaced by the animal victims, are now replaced by actors, who act as if they were those sacrificial victims. And in this movement into the as if, we can take a distance from literally believing or disbelieving in the gods, and reviewing and reimagining those primal scenes in the personas of the actors who, of course, wore masks. That's where persona came from, the mask with the hole for the mouth that spoke through it, persona. And so the goat's head was worn by the actor vicariously, so that we could relive in the personages not just of Dionysius, but of Antigone, of Oedipus, of Iphigenia, these primal scenes of pity and fear, but from a distance. What Yeats calls serenity, gaiety transfiguring all the dread. Right? So if on the one hand purgation is pity, that is to say, the movement towards the suffering of the victim, fear is the serene detachment that the theatre goer or the reader experiences because he or she has traversed poetics. Then, after the play is over, after you have suspended your disbelief, to quote Coleridge, in order to believe in the fiction, you can then, when the curtains are drawn and you exit from the amphitheatre, become a citizen again, but a citizen now who has, through the free variation of poetic possibilities, enabled him or herself to freely return to a belief in God or a disbelief in God. Now that for Aristotle, that purgation by pity and fear, was absolutely essential at an emotional level. Our emotions are distilled and purged, but also intellectually, to take that distance where we leave our positions behind, atheistic or theistic, and enter into this disposition of willingly suspending our disbelief in fiction so that we go with the poetic, and willingly suspending our belief, our positional belief in the gods or against the gods. So how might this hypothesis of suspended belief articulated by John Keats, and earlier again still by Aristotle, relate to subsequent works of literature in art? So I'm going to give a few examples from modernist literature, Joyce, Woolf, and Proust, and then conclude with two examples from painting. There was a long section on Aristotle and poetics and theopoetics, but I'm leaving that aside because I'm hoping we'll have more time for discussion and Hille's response. So let me conclude with these examples from literature and painting. Joyce. In Ulysses, we have Stephen Dedalus replying to the question, "What's God?" raised by his teacher, Deci, with the response, "A cry in the street." But what does Joyce mean when he describes God as a cry in the street? What's the sense of the sacramental, the Eucharistic, the sacred that Joyce is teasing out in that key phrase and in the constant revisiting and rewriting of a grammar of transubstantiation throughout the novel? We encounter a whole series of Eucharists throughout the narrative. Black Masses, the opening is Buck Mulligan with his shaving bowl in Martello Tower looking out over a hose head, parodying the words of the Mass in True Ibo Alatari and so on. Parodic Masses, failed communions, right up to the final failed communion between Stephen and Bloom, before we finally arrive at Molly's version of A Cry in the Street, namely her climactic yes, along with the remembered exchange of seed cake with Bloom as they kiss on Ho's head. And Joyce uses explicitly Song of Songs motifs and explicitly Eucharistic motifs. Is this not a powerful example of what Joyce calls epiphany? The sacred at the heart of the profane, the infinite in the infinitesimal, the sacramental in the quotidian. Theos echoed and retrieved as eros. Indeed, when Joyce came to finding a name for his main character, one of his main characters in Finnegan's Wake, he chose the term HCE, Here Comes Everybody, based on Ecce, as in Ecce Homo, but also as in Heitas by Scotus, that the infinite is in the most precise here and now experience of this person or this thing. I was reminded of it listening to Adrian this morning when he was giving an example of Jesus and the child, that it's not all children, and it's not a metaphor, actually. Or is it? That's a question. But it is this child. It's Heitas. It's the thisness of this particular person here and now. But I'm sure with our discussion with Tom tomorrow on Dante and Joyce, we may have occasion to return to this question of Ecce. Here comes everybody, because here comes this particular person now. With Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, I believe there are also poetic epiphanies, theopoetic epiphanies at work. My question here is, what does Lily Briscoe, the painter, mean when she talks about, quote, the little daily miracles, the match struck in the dark, the ordinary illuminations given, not made? What's going on in the text? And what is Lily's relationship to Mrs. Ramsay, who prepares and performs a quasi-Eucharistic feast in the first part of the book, which is then followed by the disenchanting interlude of death, before we return to Lily's final brushstroke, which completes her portrait of Mrs. Ramsay, and indeed the novel itself, with the words consummatum est, it is finished, in the third part of the book. Is Lily Briscoe not somehow retrieving the lost experience of the opening banquet anatheistically? Is it not only when Lily has let go of the literal Mrs. Ramsay after her death and disappearance that she can resurrect her in her portrait? What does it is finished, as she completes her painting, actually mean? In what sense is it finished? What exactly does it mean for Lily to engage in that sacramental gesture of Eucharistic memory with an invocation, of course, of Christ's final words? And what finally does Marcel Proust mean by le petit miracle in remembrance of times past? Here again we find recurring idioms of sacramental repetition, transubstantiation, resurrection, epiphany. Here also we witness the return of formerly inexperienced experiences as a second experience, an ana experience in an ana time, le temps retrouvé. I have in mind, of course, the various retrievals of forgotten moments when Marcel, in the final chapter, visits the Guermantes' salon and recalls, as he waits in the antechamber as the music is running through its recital in the main room, he recalls the stumble on the cobblestones in San Marco, in Venice, the clinking of cutlery, the reading of the Georges Sand story with his mother as a child, and so on. And what are these past moments that, repeated, return as epiphanies, which open up a future, namely the meeting with Saint-Loux's daughter? And of course, it is a moment when Marcel is radically disillusioned by the war and the loss of his nearest and dearest. And in this moment of loss and abandonment and waiting in the antechamber, suddenly these images come back. And in a very, very sacramental idiom, used by Proust, invoked by Proust. So what, in sum, does it mean for these three authors, three modernist authors, Joyce, Woolf, and Proust, who were avowedly atheist, agnostic, and apostate, to open up an imaginary space for rewriting the grammar of transubstantiation? I'm interested in exploring here the relationship between imagination and faith, faith as wager, narrative, empathy. And my wager is that the play of sacramental language in certain artists and writers, Joyce, Woolf, Proust, Keats, Hopkins, opens up a sacramental space of experience, which is a textual world of epiphany. But as Paul Ricoeur reminds us, if writing is the movement from action to text, reading is the movement from text back to action, from word back to flesh. We move in a hermeneutic arc from existential prefiguration, mimesis 1, to textual configuration, the text itself, mimesis 2, back to existential refiguration, the reader's appropriation of the text in his or her life. In this odyssey from author through text to reader, we may witness certain possibilities of transfiguration, namely the conversion from the powers that be to the power to be anew, possessed, or what I call the opening to the transformative call of the stranger. So let me end with two images and some reflections, some Anatheist reflections on what I consider to be the theopoetic power of these two images. So Murray, if we could have the perichoresis, which I'm sure you all know, and I will get some water. There we go. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this image, and rather than reading from the text, I will, in order to economize time, just give a brief summary. So we have here, of course, the Trinity, but Andrei Rublev took as his motif for the Trinity the three strangers who appear under the Mamre tree at Mamre to Abraham and Isaac to announce the birth of an impossible child. So the divine comes as a stranger, in fact, three strangers that then become in the text one stranger. Once in the exchange of food, and you have the chalice, of course, there, the impossible becomes possible, the hostility that would be the natural, normal reaction of Abraham's tribe to close his tent and respond in a hostile fashion to the strangers. He welcomes them, prostrates himself at their feet, and turns hostility into hospitality in this Eucharistic or pre-Eucharistic exchange of food prepared by Sarah. And in that moment, the impossible becomes possible in a second sense. Hostility becomes hospitality, and of course it's the same word. In Greek, xenos, in Latin, hostis is at the root of both hostility and hospitality, giving rise to Derrida's little Joycean play of words, hospitality. But that ambiguity, that transformation or conversion from hostility into hospitality is accompanied by and is inseparable from the advent of an impossible child. And in fact, Sarah uses, in Genesis 6, I think it is, uses the phrase, but it's impossible. And then Yahweh says, no, it's not impossible. And you laugh, Sarah, and she says, no, she didn't. And he says, yes, you did. It's kind of one of the first really funny moments in the gospel because he's caught her out. A bit like Jesus and the Samaritan woman. But what's very interesting about that is that those very words are translated in the Septuagint and then taken by Luke when he puts them into the mind and mouth of Mary when she says, Adunatan is Dunatan, but the impossible, it's impossible. And then the angel says, well, what's impossible to you is possible to God. But we'll come to the Annunciation in a moment. So this inaugural moment of opening to the impossible, to the infinite, to pick up Adrian's word this morning, to the event of hospitality, of sacred hospitality, in the carnal exchange of food, very important, then opens up the Abrahamic tradition. And one can read the Abrahamic tradition as a series of repetitions forward of this inaugural moment of hospitality. We'll come to the Annunciation in a moment. But for Rublev, the other Trinitarian iconic motifs for him were the three wise kings announcing the birth of an impossible child in Nazareth. Then the three persons at Emmaus. There are many icons in Greek and Russian Orthodox art. that show Jesus and the two strangers of Emmaus. Well, Jesus is the hospes, the stranger, as in this form of Trinity, where the divine is revealed of the risen Christ, the carnal risen Christ is revealed through the breaking of the bread, the sharing of the Eucharistic food, which also has been interpreted by John Manosakis and others as a Trinitarian dance, because then it becomes Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of course, in terms of an image for the kingdom, who move around perichoresis, the chora, which is as John interprets it, the chora akoraton, the womb of Mary that contains the uncontainable, contains the impossible. So then the chalice becomes the chora akoraton, the womb, the earth, the center, the gap, the space. And perichoresis is anatheistic, I think, not only in that it retrieves forward again and again this inaugural moment, lived eschatologically towards the kingdom, because this is an image for Rublev of the Trinitarian kingdom, but also of a dance which has a double A. Each of the persons in perichoresis dances around in such a way that it says adieu in two senses. It says adieu as welcome into my place. Perichoresis, translated into Latin, is circum incessio, with the double sense of cessio as see, cedere, I'd cede my place to you. Each of the three persons cedes the place to the other as they move around the chora, the space. But it's also cedere, where you take your place. So you move towards the other, ad deum, at the same time as you move away, ab deo. And that keeps the Trinitarian infinite constantly in motion and movement. And perichorein is primarily chorus as dance. I mean, that's its literal meaning. Chora is a kind of a Manosakis Joycean reinterpretation, but I think a very interesting one. So let's leave that there for the moment. Perhaps we can come back to it in discussion, and move to the final image of Antonio Damascina's Annunziata. So, a few words about the Annunciation, and then a small concluding reflection on this image. The Annunciation, as we've received it over time and history, is in great part a scene of religious imagination, in the deepest sense of the term. That is, a primal anatheist scenario which can be revisited in theopoetic imaginings, which may lead to renewed faith, or may not. To be more precise, I am struck that often the most effective ways of returning to this inaugural event of Christianity is through poetry and painting, rather than preaching or theory. The text of Luke is just a few lines, after all, but we have countless representations of the Annunciation throughout the centuries. Representations which explore the original moment when Mary encounters the stranger in Nazareth and ponders whether she will say yes or no. Just as Kierkegaard gets into the mind of Abraham in Fear and Trembling, a work of theopoetics if ever there was one, and Kazantzakis gets into the mind of Christ in The Last Temptation of Christ. These great artists have succeeded in getting into the imagination of Mary of Nazareth. These artists invite us to anatheistically retrieve Mary's inaugural moment of oscillation, her pondering of disbelief and belief as she responds to the summons of the stranger. It is impossible, or is it? Revisiting these images, we, readers, viewers today, relive the primal drama as if we were there, as if we were encountering these sacred figures for the first time. Theopoetics, in this sense, invites us back to the first moment of faith, of Christian faith, so that we may live it again anew in time and in space, back again anew in time and space. Without such anatheist imaginings, we have dry dogma and abstract doctrine. I'm not saying we shouldn't do theology and philosophy. We should. That's our stock and trade, most people in this room. I'm all for it. I'm just saying that our work can be nourished again and again by returning to this theopoetics, as can the faith of non-philosophers and non-theologians. But in thus anatheistically refiguring the moment of Mary's wager, we discover that It was a deeply Anatheist moment. Mary herself was engaged in an act of Anatheist retrieval back and promise forward. She too, like us here and now, was caught in a hermeneutic circle of past and future, before and after God. The fact that the maiden from Nazareth is almost always portrayed as reading at a lectern indicates, I believe, that she's recalling the narratives of her Abrahamic faith and the various wagers which her ancestors made when solicited by divine summons, by angels in disguise, from Abraham and Jacob to Tobias and Samuel, and indeed the same words are used, diadorektai, she was troubled. The Nazarena is reliving the past as she makes her leap of faith into the future, choosing freely to believe that the impossible may be possible, that she will conceive a child, just like Sarah before her when visited by divine strangers. This moment of free choice, then, recalling the past and anticipating the future, is a primordial instance of the anatime of anatheism. For at this oscillating instant where eternity hovers over the here and now, Mary is poised before the options of belief and disbelief. We're told in Luke that in this anatheist moment of freedom, she was troubled and pondered. It's a hard one. A lot's going on in her head and heart. The Greek term for pondering is dialogismai. She is dialoguing with the stranger visitor, Gabriel, and with herself, with all the voices in her head saying, do it, don't do it. And from out of this welter of possibilities, she chooses. Moreover, I would claim that if she did not choose or was not free to choose from a space of negative capability, of imaginative empathy and openness to the stranger, the wager would have been fixed. The incarnation would be violation. Theism, without a moment of anatheism, is a risk to human freedom and trust. But it's also important to recognize that this pondering, this aftering, this drama of wager, of responding to the call, is carnal. We're concerned with a carnal hermeneutics. It's a thinking again in the flesh. It happens in an instant. Neither a reflex response to a stimulus nor a disembodied cogito with clear and distinct ideas. Mary is thinking through the body and embodying her text in action. That's why if, in almost all the portraits, she has a book in one hand, she has a lily representing the senses, odor, in the other. Mary's response to Gabriel is one of hermeneutic savvy, a felt knowledge, a thinking that is also a touching and tasting, sapientia as sapere, savourer, savoir. For us then, viewers and readers today, reimagining the sacred can thus revive faith, make it live again, revivre. It can bring us back to the anatheist moment and let us bring that moment back into our lives again if we so choose. We become dramatic contemporaries of the wager. That's anatheism. If faith needs its prophets, it also, I'm suggesting, needs its poets and its painters. So I will sign off with a brief meditation, really, I suppose, is the best word for it, or reflection, on this image by de Massima. I remember the first time I came to Chicago, I was visiting David Tracy and speaking to his students, and one of his students, I think his name was Chris Shepard, took me to a jazz bar. I'd never been to a jazz bar, but I learned what it means to riff. And this would be my humble tribute and thank you to Chris Shepard, and who shepherded me into a jazz bar in downtown Boston, whatever it was, 15 or 20 years ago. So here goes a few final paragraphs on this particular painting. A strange annunciation. Just the young woman, no angel. Foreground without background. No doves, no rays of light, no columns, no lilies. No celestial sky or gilded halo. Only her and us at the moment. Antonello de Massina's painting embodies Luke's phrase about the girl at Nazareth. She was troubled and pondered. Here she ponders. See her face, in two minds between yes and no. Voglio non voglio, they say in Sicily, where the image hangs today in the Palazzo Abatellis in Palermo. She hovers still on the threshold, passing to and fro, hither and thither, fore and aft. Now look at the line running from the top of her blue mantle, along the bridge of her nose, straight down through the V of her shawl, through the knuckles of her hand, to that light-dark dividing edge of the lectern. The lectern with two sides, one illuminated, one shadowed, bearing the book with that one lifted page, opening and closing in an Anatheist instant. Anatheist, after God and before God, too early and too late. So what's she pondering? And why must it wait, suspended in midair, as she responds to what calls her in the flesh, from writing to touch, from parchment to skin? Infinitesimal suspension mirroring in turn her hands, ambidextrous. One hand opening towards the viewer, the stranger, the painter, you and me. The other closing her mantle, protecting, hiding, withholding. And look at those eyes, riddling as Mona Lisa's, averted as they ponder. The right turning inward, withdrawing into shade, as the left brightens slowly, maybe, into a smile of yes. Luke's gospel tells us little, which is why we need painters and poets. Painters of the Annunciation, like Damascena, Botticelli, Raphael, and many others who dared visualize and imagine. Poets like Levertov, Hutchins, Simonovich, who dared speak. They let us look and listen again. One line from one of the poets of the Annunciation, Denise Levertov. God waited. She was free to accept or refuse. Choice, integral to humanness. Another poem, this time from Andrew Hodgins on the Annunciation. And though she will, she's not yet said, behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, as she refuses, accepts, refuses, thinks again. Anna. Like the poets, Damascena invites us, each one of us, to be an angelos, a messenger where divine meets human. The Hebrew for angelos means one sent, one going. L'Annunziata captures the Nazarena on the threshold, oscillating between light and dark as she declines and consents. We may call her the Nazarena because Mary is too late. She's left the girl behind. And Madonna is too soon. She is not yet the mother of all men. Neither daughter nor mother, neither servant nor spouse, she hangs between. Nazarena is her middle name. Nazareth, her home without home. Her most familiar place of strangeness, unheimlich. Nazareth from the verb nazar, to keep secrets, as in Isaiah's secret things. But, my God, what is she thinking? What is she imagining as the page turns? What story from Torah or Talmud has lit her mind and body and prepared her for the message? Is it Eve possessed by the lust of the eyes as forbidden fruit is offered? Is it Sarah receiving strangers who promise an impossible child at Mamre? The same words, as I mentioned, uttered by Sarah's visitors at Mamre, nothing is impossible to God, Genesis 18:14, are used by Luke 1:30 to describe the announcement to Mary. Or is it Rachel, courted by Jacob at the well, the same place where the Samaritan woman would play guessing games with the Nazarena's son? Or is it Susanna, surprised by lusty elders in her solitude? Who knows what thoughts passed through her soul as she reads from the lectern? The Nazarena never tells. She never wrote it down in book or diary or letter or note. She only reads pages and faces, pages as faces, faces as pages. Hers was a carnal hermeneutics of hand and scent, of ear and eye, making sense of her senses. Faith beyond words, faith as fiancée and fidens, trust over terror. And Rilke's right, every angel is terrible. Grace over fear. So Nazarena is neither first nor last. After Sarah and the biblical matriarchs, and before Teresa of Avila and the theoerotic mystics, Margaret Parete, Margaret Mary Alacoque, the Beguines, Etty Hillesum. This maiden from Nazareth is always too early and already too late. Her time is out of time, nachträglich, before ours and after ours, uncanny, traumatic, anachronic, anatheistic. The Nazarena's double response to hosting the stranger's impossible love is perhaps our condition too. Is she not telling us that we also dwell in a moment of ANA, where the first A of adieu, withdrawing, abstaining, absenting, passes through flesh into the second A of adieu, opening up, reaching out, attending? suspended between the double A of abdeo and ad deum, hovering in the interim, the no man's land of neither here nor there. The N at the heart of Anna is the Nazarena herself, in flesh and blood, in cloak and book, in hands and eyes and mouth and look. She is the N of the Nunc, between before and after. Our Lady of Milieu, inhabiting the space between here and there, she dwells amongst us, between the two A's of already and advent, between the Deus absconditus and the Deus adventurus, the now of the Nazarena, forever present. Hic et nunc, nunc aeternus, verbum caro factum est, the word made flesh again and again. Thank you.
Great. Now we have some comments before our discussion time from Professor Hille Haker. She is the Richard McCormick S.J. Chair of Moral Theology here at Loyola University Chicago. She was elected president of Societas Ethica in 2015 at its annual conference in Sweden, and has been a member of the European Group on Ethics and Sciences and New Technologies of the European Commission since 2005. Her research, among other things, has focused on technology and bioethics, moral identity, and feminist and Christian ethics. Professor Haker.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh my gosh, how to respond to the richness of Richard Kearney's lecture. I'm going to jazz a little bit, yeah? So I'm taking up a motive and offer you a variant rather than a critical response. In his work on God After God, or Anatheism, Richard Kearney has provided us with an indispensable interpretation of the challenge of God. While I'm responding as an ethicist, I want to take up only one element of this turn to God after God, which in fact is also a turn to God before God, namely the reimagination of the concept of the sacred as the encounter with a stranger as the other, and the other in capital letters. It is a prominent motive in Richard's work that it might be so that it might turn out to be the key to the whole concept. I will try to show why. The Anatheist turn to the sacred is a turn to experience, more precisely to a specific kind of experience that is, as Richard argues, akin but not identical with the spiritual and the religious. Rather, it is the quote, opening oneself to the original and enduring promise of a sacred stranger, an absolute other who comes as a gift, call, summons, as invitation to hospitality and justice, end of quote. And the hermeneutic retrieval of sacred things that belongs to this God after God depicts the sacred as erratic, enigmatic, strange, and disturbing as its counterpart of past conceptions of the sacred. In contrast to traditional concepts, however, the Anatheist sacred is deeply modern. It is rather found in the junk of our way of life than in the extraordinary things. Benjamin's figure of the junk collector, the Lumpensammler, is a deliberate choice to describe the historian's task. Likewise, if we are to reimagine the sacred after God, we will rather find it in the junk than in the spaces, times, and sites that are the publicly constructed notions of the sacred, often turning out as ideological simulacra of the sacred. Speaking of Wrigley Fields, if the sacred is a dimension of everything, it can only be described in these things' relation to subjectivity or experience. It does not rest in the special quality of extraordinary objects, spaces, or times. We have to think newly how to understand the kairos, and the kora. And we will see that rather than finding the sacred ourselves, wherever, whenever, it will find us. In this, the Anatheist sacred is a postmodern conception. I want to pause here and reflect upon the shift and the understanding of the sacred. And since I recently had the opportunity to work a little with the German social philosopher Hans Joas, no stranger to Chicago, let me quickly refer to his studies on the sacred. In the sociological studies of religion, the category of the sacred is closely linked to transcendence. Echoing what Richard says, Joas understands this in experiential terms. Transcendence is primarily seen as self-transcendence, which sociologists of religion like Durkheim or Simmel consider as an anthropological given. The experience of transcendence opens a gap within the self. People feel, I quote Joas, drawn beyond the boundaries of the self, and subsequently identify the source of the power they have experienced, which exceeds the force of their own will, but on which their own life force also depends as lying outside of them, end of quote. In this process, ideas are formed as ideals, which function as the ground of one's existence, one's belief, or one's morality. Good and evil, for example, are determined in view of this ideal, which becomes the sacred other force of oneself. The experiential dimension of the ideal formation, as Joas calls it, alludes to the fact that it is encountered, captured in the German word Widerfahrnis, rather than Erfahrung. Rather than being constructed or chosen, the sacred is experienced as other. The self is seized by something other than herself, rendering her passive and receptive rather than active and autonomous. The sacred, and not the religion, is the central term of this experience. While the sacred can take the form of religion, and in fact has mostly been articulated in religious terms, it can also emerge in other, predominantly, actually, political forms. In any case, however, the facts of ideal formation, as Joas calls it, is constitutive for any reflective concept of the self. Ideal formations, Joas claims, emerge, transform, and shift throughout history. This is described in the major works of the sacred from Rudolf Otto to Richard Scheffler, Paul Ricoeur, Carsten Kolpe, or Wolfgang Gantke, and it is reflected in the status the sacred traditionally gains. It is set apart as other, pure, or extraordinary. And yet, in order to be experienced at all, the transcendent sacred must be configured. In many traditions, the sacred is configured and thus embodied in objects, rites, or practices to the effect that the singular experience becomes a shared and collective experience. This means, in order to become a part of the public or shared experience, the extraordinary, the unspeakable, must be configured in the shared and public language and refigured by the self. I will leave Joas here for a moment and return to anatheism. Richards is completely in line with the modern sociologists of the sacred. Something that is experienced pre-reflectively on an existential level is configured in and through language, the Aristotelian mythos. And since it is publicly shared, it is refigured in the reception process. In the experience of reading, of looking, of touching, naming the unnameable is still naming, we encounter what Richard calls a textual world of epiphany. The Hebrew Bible and the Gospels wrestle with this. God's face, the panim, that represents the person or identity of a person, must not be seen by mortal beings. Jesus is touched all the time, but Christ must not be touched. Noli me tangere. The text of the tradition is sacred, and as such, untouchable. and so on. It is perhaps not a coincidence that we can retrieve Aristotle's Poetics up to today and understand the cathartic effect of the Greek tragedy, the relief from suffering and fear, Elios and Phobos, by way of the aesthetic experience of the semblance, the as if of the implotment. Tragedies, as all narratives, including the comedies, by the way, which often are subversive tales of the sacred as ideologies, entail the catharsis from the power of the other, the sacred, through the experience of the as if we could be someone else with another story, another normative system, another ideal formation, another time and space, another life story. There is a break, however, within the tradition of the sacred, and this paves the way to the prehistory of anatheism. In contrast to Weber, for Joas, this break is not so much the disenchantment of the world, but the sacralization of the person. In his book, Sacredness of the Person, Joas reconstructs its genealogy with the sacredness of the human, making it into many so-called secular human rights documents. Joas shows that the notion of the sacredness of the person is not just a linguistic remnant of a past religious history that transformed into secular morality, but rather it is a new kind of the sacred, the modern turn to the subject or the self. Richard, I think, rejects this complete internalization or subjectivization of the sacred in a slightly different retrieval of the sacred, and rightly so, I were told. As I said, he distinguishes the sacred from the spiritual and from the religious. The spiritual stands for any subjective, aesthetic experience of self-transcendence, where religion stands for truth claims. The sacred, however, is akin to both, while keeping both at a distance. It shares with the spiritual, the subjective, experiential element of self-transcendence and the desire for the strangeness that goes beyond cognition. I were told, however, that at this level, the spiritual and the sacred cannot be kept apart. The sacred is, however, also akin to the truth claims, the rituals, and the institution of a religion. Since these are nameable and therefore public, they do not reflect the disruptive nature, the openness to the enduring promise of the sacred stranger, as which Richard defined the experience of the sacred. But without turning to this material side of religion, the experience of the sacred is reduced to the spiritual dimension, which is at the same time an aesthetic experience. The crucial kinship of the sacred is not spirituality, I think, but indeed religion, its material side. The adieu that accompanies anatheism makes this clear without Richard arguing for it theologically, or not arguing enough, I would say. It speaks about God, it addresses God, and it responds to God. This makes the sacred not only akin to religion, it turns it into religion, more precisely into theology, anatheism. I'm not entirely satisfied with my result, however. Joas has taught me to be vigilant. The sacred has always been used to legitimize ideologies. And indeed, I see the danger of ideology in the radically aesthetic or spiritual connotation of the sacred. At least if Christianity is interpreted in this way, ignoring its ethical and political content or Gehalt. There is a reason that religions must make some truth claims, and that those who commit to a religion must be able to reason about these claims. This is at least what Christianity demands of anyone who utters the adieu. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter 3:15. It is here that the concept of hospitality comes into play. It is certainly an important motive of Christian theology, but I would say that the concept of the sacred is more or even different than this conversion or transformation of hostility to hospitality, not the least because it is not clear whether one should now host God within oneself, as another word for an ideal formation, to use yours terms, or take its ethical dimension more seriously. In depicting the sacred as the encounter with a stranger, as other, it does not transcend the aura of the extraordinary. It is the radiance that Baudelaire longs for, as Benjamin has it, at the moment of its loss. The adult may remember the child's naivety of the once experienced sacredness and sense the yearning for it forever, Hölderlin. But no adult can undo the process of growing up, departing from the pre-reflective slumber. Christianity, I would hold, is not auratic. Christianity is the departure, or more precisely, the liberation from the mythical aura that we remember in the aesthetic experience of the sacred. In Christianity, we find the history of ever new configurations and refigurations of the sacred, who is also, or which is also, the sacred in capital letters. The creating, loving, giving, demanding, judging, and forgiving God in this religion embodies ever new beginnings and justice. Justice for the victims and ever new beginnings for all sinners in history. This God demands loyalty and desires the love of those whom he loves. In this particular conception of the sacred as a religion, the sacredness of the human is not grounded in rationality or capabilities, not even in the capability to open herself up to the sacred stranger. Ultimately, it is grounded not in the experience, but in an existential conviction, a trust of unconditional recognition by God before any deed, sacrifice, commitment, or merit, or after the misdeed, the murder, the guilt. This recognition is not an experience, but the premise of any self-experience. The experience of the sacred itself cannot be detached from the moral experience of responsibility as the claim and ability to respond to the recognition and to respond to the other, not only as a stranger, but as a brother or sister, including Sister Earth, as Francis has it in his Canticle of Love. Christianity maintains this means, but also transforms the otherness of the sacred stranger. It transforms it into the moral relation between brothers and sisters. It transforms the encounter with the extraordinary, the epiphany, into the ethical encounter with a neighbor, who in the Gospel of Jesus is more often depicted as the very ordinary social junkie than as the honorable man. Christianity is indeed transformative, but its measure is this moral revolution, the decentering of the extraordinary sacred subject, the socially honored, dignified person, to the most ordinary, undignified human at the margins of society. And in this, Christianity is deeply political. Love of God and love of one's brother, neighbor, or stranger, they all belong together. If anatheism is the remembrance of this ethical wager, which is as much a promise as it is an ethical demand, then I believe it is indeed indispensable. A theology that tries to give a new meaning to God. Theologically speaking, however, Christianity makes the claim on us to decipher the moral meaning of the sacred rather than resting at its spiritual and existential dimension. Ethically speaking, we can only respond in turning to the you. And you will, in one way or the other, always be a stranger, whom we did not choose to live together with, but to whom we are to be a neighbor rather than yet another stranger. God after God is the sacred in capital letters after the loss of the aurora. It leaves us humbly before God. Ah, Dieu. What is God? A cry in the street, yes. It's also, is it back? No, the idle man in our poster lying naked in the landscape trying to reach out to God. While his brothers are being murdered and his sisters are being raped. And yet, there's also this woman, while he is there in the landscape, in labor, giving birth to the impossible child, the Son of God and a woman, a son of a woman, the Messiah.